Hi, Owen.
Hi, Serge. Nice to see you.
Yeah, same here. So we're going to talk about addiction, and you have the experience of both writing a book about it and talking about it from the side of people who are not addicted, but also of having lived the life of an addict. And so we're going to talk about both of these perspectives.
Good. Well, thanks. So let me just say a little bit about, uh, you know, being on both sides of the equation. Many people, of course, who work in the addiction field, coaches and therapists, have both been addicts and in recovery. And so, in some sense, there are a lot of people who I follow who've been very public about their own struggles with addiction, and also at the same time take what they learn once they get to recovery and then try to help other people along the way. Um, One of the in my own case, it was well, I don't want to say it was unique, but it was rather peculiar in a sense that added to my cognitive dissonance being an addict. And the reason was basically this. Uh, I went to graduate school after spending 4 years as an undergraduate trying to understand what makes people tick. I was interested in psychology, philosophy, anthropology. If I hadn't been such a mama's boy, I probably would have been an anthropologist, I think, and thought I could go off in the world, but I couldn't leave my couldn't leave my family. Um, so I did the next best thing, which was study basically in philosophy, asking the question, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be live a good human life? What makes us tick? What are our various motivations? And and so by the time I became a full-on addict, I had been studying for a long time the very thing which was escaping me or tripping me up, which was my own mind and my own body and my own behavior. So I don't know if that increased the way in which my alcoholism and my addiction to benzodiazepines and my abuse of benzodiazepines as well was in some sense it wasn't unique at all. Maybe what was peculiar was that I had all this book knowledge about what different psychological theories say about what makes people tick. I had a lot of experience studying different theories about human nature. And here I was in a bind, a maze I couldn't escape. And all the book knowledge in the world didn't help me through that at
Yeah,
the
yeah.
time.
So just I have a habit of summarizing a little bit what I hear to.
Good. Yep.
So in a way, a different setup of the situation is here is young Owen, who has learned everything that the books have to say about what is human nature and what makes people tick. But, young Owen has never really figured out how he functions.
So,
And he's overwhelmed and basically gets lost in what is offered by the culture for people who are overwhelmed.
yeah. Good. And now it's an interesting question whether or not I would put it that way. The first part I totally agree with. Yes, Owen didn't understand himself. And in some sense, that we all maybe are mysteries to ourselves. So I was certainly that. And knowing different theories wasn't helping me gain access to what made me tick. And it was really not, although by the time that I got interested, uh, uh, for a long time, I kind of avoided trying to especially study what was known among psychologists and neuroscientists about addiction, because in some sense, I did want to just push that off to the side. There were some reasons that had to do with denial and minimization of my own addiction, because like many addicts, I was in the midst of being quite clearly addicted while still thinking something like, I'm a high functioning heavy drinker and I mix that with pills whenever I can have both at once. And my story about myself was for the longest time when I was an addict was not that I was an addict. It was that I was something else. I fed that illusion or delusion, depending on how we want to describe it, um, that I was in some sense because I was pretty productive. I was pretty professionally successful. And by the way, a surprising number of people say to me things like this. They say, "How were you so productive if you were an addict?" And I said, "You're around people like me all the time who you don't know are suffering terrible addictions, but we're holding it together enough to, in some cases, even excel at what we do
Yeah.
by ordinary standards."
And
So,
you
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 know,
made the point very clearly that actually being an addict does not mean necessarily being totally powerless about everything, but actually being quite able to manage some things. In fact, to manage your life of addiction in order to make it possible for it to continue.
that's right. Exactly right. Yes. I mean, it takes a tremendous amount of energy, of course, more than usual amount of energy, because you've got to be strategizing a huge amount to figure out how to keep a marriage together. Usually that's going to be built on, at least in my case and other addicts I've spoken to, keeping a relationship going and being a decent partner involves a lot of dissembling, a lot of lying, um, a lot of sneaking. And the same thing with doing your job well and showing up to work. I mean, there's a lot of strategizing, but I was able to do that. And many, many addicts are able to do that, but the misery in their souls and the quality of their relationships inevitably is really suffering.
Yeah, yeah. So what you're talking about is changing the mental picture that people have about addict as somebody who's down in the gutter, but it can be somebody who is high functioning and who seems in lots of ways normal. And it
That's
just
right.
simply that this person is running the marathon with a backpack with some lead on it, whereas
That's
the
right.
others are just running without. And maybe that person has the capacity to carry the bag so that
Yeah.
it's less visible.
Yeah, exactly right. That's a really good analogy. I've never heard it before. But yes, the mental weight of it. I mean, people talk about how, addicts were obsessing and we're thinking about our drug of choice all the time. We definitely are doing that pretty often, but we're also as often having to think about how to make it through the day, accomplishing the tasks we are required to do, as it were, even sometimes tasks we want to do for our own sake. We believe in these tasks. We believe in being a good husband or a good father, a good scholar, a good teacher. But we know we have to also make room for our addiction. And that requires all kinds of, yeah, it's lead backpacks, it's Jenga toys up to the ceiling. It's a kind of crazy, exhausting exercise. And
Yeah.
when I think about it, I'm delighted no longer to be in the middle of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so the another analogy that comes to mind is the analogy of passing, just like in terms of racial prejudice, um,
Yes,
the finding a way to live as if and to in a way to go beyond or behind the concept of society in order to seem normal.
that's right. Exactly right. And you see this more among many people since I've written this book who were around me during those years will say things like, "Did I know you then?" And I say, "Yes." And they're surprised. They're surprised because they just would think, as you say, their mental picture of someone who admits to not being able to hold it together because they became an addict is someone who is going to be drunk in front of them, who's going to be falling down, who's going to be causing more mayhem, who's getting fired from jobs. It isn't always that way
Yeah,
at all. That's right.
yeah, yeah. And so um, if we start with that notion that young Owen started life full of theory, but not knowing much about life itself, in a way, looking back at your journey is a classic journey of
Yeah.
actually um, reluctantly going into adventures um, from which you gain hard-won experience.
Right. Well, when I think about my own story, especially if we go back to the really young Owen, it might be helpful to your listeners to know the what is like a flashbulb memory of my first drinking episode, because it had a profound effect on me. And I know since you read the book, you know about it, but I was about 12 years old and I was at a friend's house after school. I was in eighth grade, and we tried hard cider, a little glass full of his dad's hard cider, maybe a juice glass or an inch. I don't know, nothing much. And I noticed that the taste was unusual, and it was a little bit stronger than any apple cider I'd had. And that day, when I walked home a mile and a half from my friend Johnny's house, the whole world felt different. I remember it was an autumn day, the leaves were falling. It was kind of Halloweenish out. The light was Halloweenish. And suddenly on the way home, I just felt different. And the only way to describe it is that I felt not scared.
Mhm.
Um, I wouldn't have said prior to that I was scared. In fact, I don't even think now that that would have been a correct description. It would be more something like I was a shy little boy. Um, I was a year younger than the other kids. I was on the shy side. I was a little more studious than your average kid my age. So it wasn't like I didn't fit. I had a lot of friends, people liked me, but I was on the shy side. And suddenly I felt not shy, not anxious, not scared. And I didn't chase that drink after that right away at all. After all, I was only 12 years old.
Yeah.
And but I did register that. And by the time I did start to drink, all through college, there was, as far as I could tell, there was never any education, at least that my generation had, um, uh, in school or even parentally, about the dangers of alcohol. In fact, if anything, it was the opposite. It was, we're a kind of a, my family was Irish Catholic. We people drink, our relatives drink, we drink at baptisms, we drink at confirmations, we drink at wakes, we drink before and after, we drink at the end of the day to reduce anxiety. So I had a blueprint
Hmm. Hmm.
for one, what I now understand to be a drug, but I didn't understand it as a little boy, for a drug that my father took at the end of every day because it alleviated the anxiety of being a high pressure businessman in Manhattan.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was a wonderful sort of ceremonial thing. And then, of course, by the time you get to college or high school and you want to meet a girl, people tell you, okay, the way you do this is you take the girl to the movie, but when you go to the movie, you have a six pack of beer in the car and so on and so forth. So everything important in life, love, friendship, family, was for me, I saw it in front of me, was had to do with taking in a ceremonial way this
Yeah.
substance. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So there was a social blueprint where the path was very clear
that's right.
and you just engage in the path. And there was also something like personal social, the discovery that actually a little bit of alcohol activates your superpower, and from shy, you become comfortable.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, that was exactly it. I mean, you know, I become a little more attractive to girls. I think, I'm a little bit more socially adept than I thought I was. Well, that doesn't last forever, but it does make one feel that way, and you have those thoughts. And then, of course, we're great imitators, Serge, right? So by the time I go to college, well, what everybody does there is they drink too much.
Yeah.
And again, kind of completely, at least at that time, socially endorsed. I think now, at least, I don't know, you would know better than I do. Like at my university, some students have told me at Duke that in dormitories, every dormitory now has at least posters which indicate how many drinks for an average boy and an average girl will get them in trouble with the law if they drive the point zero 0.08, or would get them sick, or could make them drunk. And whatever it is for the average size young man and the average size young woman is not a lot. It's a lot less than what normal college students drink.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but that doesn't speak to the availability then of all the other drugs that are available for students to change their personalities and minds and so on and so forth. But yeah, so there was a social blueprint, and that's what I think is so underestimated sometimes in some of the work that comes out of places like the National Institute of Health or the National Institute of Drug Abuse, is that there of course there are brain aspects to this. We're embodied physical beings, we're complicated mammals. So of course there are things going on in our metabolic system, there are things going on in our brains. There sure look like there's some changes in our brains that are difficult to overcome, like the cravings and the obsessions, and sometimes willpower doesn't work. But that doesn't mean that we should reduce our understanding of addiction to being just a brain disease,
Yeah.
because it's clearly has social roots, it has social effects, and it has social constituents. I talk a lot in the book, and you and I were mentioning this earlier, about the ways in which, for certain people, you're being a person who uses your drug of choice means being part of the particular community that you're supposed to be part of. In my case, it was how our family did celebrations and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah. But so, yes, it's deeply rooted in culture or in tribe of choice.
Yep.
And also, not every member of the tribe becomes an addict. They may all be heavy drinkers or heavy drug users, but
Yep.
they're not all addicts. And
That's
so,
right.
and we're talking here about the passage from one to the other, or the difference in quality that happens there.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, that's the bewildering thing about addictions, that some people who I still meet people sometimes who are like this. I think, wow, that person seems like they drink a lot and it just isn't affecting them negatively. They can take it or leave it. They do seem, and that's just an interesting difference in different people's psychobiology, I take it. Um, uh, I see it in my family of origin with my different cousin groups. Some cousin groups had no problems with alcoholism. They drink a lot. I don't mean that, but other ones, I mean, today they're all celebrating St. Patrick's Day in a very traditional way. In my family of origin, none of us we're all celebrating St. Patrick's Day, but not in the traditional way, the way we would have. Well, we would have celebrated every day if it was as if it was St. Patrick's Day. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So what's your sense of um, what made you an addict instead of just a heavy drinker?
Well, I don't think, here we could go, and, you and I might have something to talk about here in terms of different background theories. So I think, uh, and one of the things I'd like to sort of emphasize in the book is that once one looks really at the statistics broadly construed, it looks like there certainly is a large group of addicts who are self-medicating, in some sense of self-medicating. That is, they have an antecedent, and it could be mild or it could be severe psychological thingamajig. I don't even want to call it a problem. Again, it just might be something very simple, like a little bit more than the average anxiety
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
novel experiences. Um, Alcohol is good for that. Um, it could be the shy thing. Alcohol is good for that. It could be something that much more severe. So, for example, it looks like up to 50% of people with bipolar disorder become addicted to alcohol in America at some time or other. and about 10% of them become addicted to other substances. So that's an astronomically high
Yeah.
rate
Yeah. Yeah.
of addiction among a subgroup who clearly are trying to do something to their own psychobiology, which they find fraught. And I guess it will depend. Some of them will be doing it because they want to put a lid on the mania, maybe. And some people will be doing it because they want to come out of the depression, even though alcohol is a depressant.
But for
But
yourself,
so,
your sense of yourself, is it something where you have some sense of what happened, or is it in a way kind of a mystery?
well, both. Okay, good. So the way I think about it in my own case is that it was good for me. So the answer is both. I don't. Uh, I I think that I'm a case that's like this. I had a generally happy childhood. Nothing unusual, nothing traumatic happened in my family of origin. Sure, you know, I've been seeing psychiatrists for so long. I have stories about everything, but uh, they're not all true. So, but my family, growing up, I have a good childhood. I had some normal sort of little things that I wanted to like adjust, and I found out I could adjust them pharmaceutically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In other words, I knew what alcohol did for the anxiety and the shyness. I knew that pot made me make interesting connections perceptually and musically. So I used to love that in college too. So I was quite aware of the different effects that different drugs had for me. And I think that at a certain point, um, as we say, people will say this in Alcoholics Anonymous, the off switch broke. I mean, for some reason, the thing in me that made me able to say, I'll have this 2 drinks now and stop, that broke at some point. And I couldn't get it back I couldn't rewire it. So that part is quite mysterious because it felt like something sort of brute in the
Yeah.
sense of
Yeah.
it felt like something neurophysiological, metabolic and neurophysiological.
Do
So
you
that
remember,
part,
do you remember about what age or what time that
I,
happened?
yeah, I was about 24 or 5. And I do remember, although by then I was probably uh, hooked, I had a girlfriend at the time who said to me, uh, she suggested that I drank too much. She might have done more than suggest that we drank too much, that I drank too much. But I remember the day that I tried, therefore, not to drink, and it was very hard. And I
Mm.
remember what I did was I bought a quart of beer, which by then was not a lot for me to just get me even, and then brush my teeth and, you know, made believe I hadn't drank that day. But so by the time I was 24 or so, I think I was pretty deep. In those years, the drinking age was 18 in New York. So I got a good start at 18. I didn't drink much before 18, but then by within 5 years, I'd say in retrospect, I was quite hooked. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so at that time, you were still, you knew that you were hooked, but you were still not in any possible way thinking of yourself as an alcoholic or an addict.
It's a really good question. I was trying hard not to, is the answer. Yeah. And um, I did have role models like my own father, who he was kind of amazing to this. I mean, he passed away a long time ago in the 1990s. But to this day, I don't know what to say about him and his drinking habits. I don't take other people's inventories. But he was possibly, to me, in my head, a high functioning drinker.
Hmm.
Now, do we want to say alcoholic drinker, but still high functioning? I didn't know those categories very well, but I certainly, in retrospect, think that I was alcoholic by the time I was 24. Yes, but you're right. I tried desperately because what happened one time in 1987, when I was 38 years old, um, by then, many of my siblings were in recovery. I'm the oldest of 6. And then one of my youngest sibling, my brother, 17 years younger than me, died in a solo drunk driving accident near where you live in Scarsdale, actually, between White Plains and Hartsdale. And uh, when we buried him, I said to my other brother, as we're, I said, I'm going to give up drinking because drinking causes trouble in our family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that was my way of sort of acknowledging on the one hand that I shouldn't drink, but not fully acknowledging that I was alcoholic, but realizing there's some systemic problems here. Something's happening.
Right,
So I
right.
gave up then for 7 years, and I had 7 years between 1987 and 1994 in which I was using and sometimes abusing benzodiazepines, but not drinking. But then I went back out again and stayed out for 10 more years in 94.
Yeah, yeah. And so the stopping to drink, is that something you did on your own or with help?
I did it on my own with sort of a psychiatrist behind me, but I did not go to AA. And the reason I didn't go to AA, I have a peculiar relationship with AA that I mentioned at the beginning of the book. When Alcoholics Anonymous started in 1935, 4 years later, they published the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob suddenly needed an accountant to make sure that they stayed nonprofit status. And my dad's first partner, a guy named Wilbur Smith, who lived in Armonk, New York, Wilbur was one of the original members of the Dayton group, or the maybe he was Dayton and then New York. Anyway, he was given the AA account, and that meant that my father eventually, as a much younger accountant, took over the Alcoholics Anonymous account. So we would always hear around, again, during cocktail hour sometimes, about the work that my dad did with Alcoholics Anonymous. My father was on the board of AA, many different boards. He was often going to Pocono Hills to where the Rockefellers lived and supported AA. My father spoke at International AA meeting in Montreal in the early 70s, and he was the executor of Lois Wilson's will when she died in the 90s. So we had a very intimate relationship with AA sort of through that. Some of my siblings were in it, but I thought uh, it's a religious cult and I'm not doing it. So that was my first time around. When I became truly desperate and got sober 18 years ago, finally, for the umpteenth time, but the last time, I hope, um, uh, I did go to AA. I went to it all the time. I went to 1,000 meetings in 90 days if I could have.
Hmm.
I went all the time. And some people, I that that was a turning point for me going
Yeah,
to AA. I
yeah,
needed it eventually. I was desperate. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so, very related to the point you make about addiction being something that has to do with connection with people, and and you found the value in that. You want to talk a little bit about what that was for you?
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I distinguish in my so when I think a lot about what it is about AA that gave it its power. And you of course are well known for your own revision of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And early on in recovery, when I was struggling with some of the religiosity in the 12 steps of AA, because I think it's eight of the 12 steps mention a higher power as you understand him or God explicitly, and only two steps mention addiction. So I was pretty resistant even when I was totally desperate at death's door, um, but going to meetings, but I was pretty resistant to what I felt was the religious aspects to it. So I was always rewriting the 12 steps to get rid of references to God and higher power and so on and so forth. But I was lucky enough to have two friends, two guys who were, one of them had long-term recovery, one was only a little bit ahead of me. Um, but they were both agnostics and or atheists like I am. And I realized, and they basically said, look at the your higher power can be God as you understand him can be a group of drunks. And that's what we are. We're here for each other. We have the same malady. We need time out, and we can spend it in fellowship with each other. So I personally think that certainly for me, it was the fellowship, that is the solidarity with other human beings who were trying to escape the same sort of fatal predicament that I seem to be, the road I seem to be going down, and who would just sit with me. And I thought that meetings were genius because I thought that, the idea of just sharing only your experience, strength, and hope as they pertain to your addiction was a brilliant sort of strategy for keeping meetings focused. And one could really avoid talking too much about the sort of meta theory, the background theory,
Hmm.
how theological it is, and so on and so forth. And so I met many people that I love, and I was also lucky that there were meetings here in Durham, North Carolina. There was an agnostics and atheists meeting that I loved. There was also a gay and lesbian meeting, which I'm not gay or lesbian, but they welcomed people like me into it. And it was mostly gay and lesbian people, but I just found that both of those meetings were just different vibes from an Orthodox AA meeting,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
still very much we're doing AA-ish stuff.
Yeah.
And I just found the being able to go with a group of people who were trying to put one foot in front of the other, do the next right thing, not use that day. I really needed that because for the first 4 months of my last recovery, um, I had extraordinary craving. If I was talking to you, Serge, in those months, you might think that I was present, but I was thinking about vodka.
Mm. Mm.
I was I was sort of multitasking. I was being like I seemed like I was there, but I really wasn't. And
Yeah.
then eventually, after 4 or 5 months, something again physiological seemed to, which is hard to explain, but it seemed to get better,
Yeah.
or the craving started to dissipate. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's something about the companionship, the fellowship, the kindred spirits, the being in the same adventure together, the
Yeah.
moment by moment understanding of each other in that common endeavor that was incredibly helpful. I am curious about your experience of whether the kind of friendships you developed were different from your other friendships. Um, you know,
Yeah. Good
what
question.
what did it feel like?
Well, here's a funny story. In one way, I just had something happen the other day that was so the one of the guys who uh, got sober with me. I had lunch with him the other day. Now I've spent probably I now only see him 4 times a year, say, and then we have a lunch or something. But I used to see him for 8 years, almost every day.
Hmm.
And over lunch the other day, he said to me this. He said, "Owen, are you a Republican or a Democrat?" Now, what's interesting about that is that someone could be, because I'm very outspoken about politics to my friends,
Hmm.
but to that friend, it didn't come up. And why didn't it come up? It's one of the magical things about AA. It sort of wasn't part of our experience, strength, and hope, about addiction. It just
Yeah,
wasn't.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
realized, I said, now, I so so that's one thing. Now that's about what they didn't have,
Hmm.
because anybody who, what do they do have though? I think one of the things that I think that I had in those relationships is pretty much complete honesty about things I did, people I let down, some of which were absolutely humiliating, ridiculous, embarrassing, uh, that I would feel comfortable telling people in AA about. if
Hmm.
they came up. They don't always come up. It isn't like, one has to sort of say, and then I did this, and then I did that, and, you know, drunkalog, as we call them. But it was just the feeling of a comfort level of being able to say, and then it was so bad that, I loved her, but she said to me, it's me or the booze. And you say, I chose the booze. Can you believe what a fucking idiot I am? And I
Mm-hmm.
knew it, and I knew it at the time. And there were friends. So I have other friends who are as dear to me as can be, people who are, um, just friends from college. I don't tell them, those things don't come up. The unbelievably private, somewhat baffling, humiliating, awful things. It is that they come up a lot with my AA friends, but when they do, I feel safe
Yeah.
in a way that
Yeah.
I wouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily with other people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That with regular friends, what happens is you can have a great time, but even without necessarily consciously being aware of it, there's some things that are off the table.
you're right.
And,
Exactly right.
and so there is a sense of, maybe that secret, that backpack, that something that is not, acknowledged there.
That's right.
And with the AA friendships came the possibility of very naturally talking about what would have been unthinkable to talk about in other circumstances.
Exactly right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And of course, some of the things that, that brings us to the distinction between AA as a fellowship and AA as an official program where one has to go through each of the 12 steps as a matter of sort of almost like Jesuit discipline. It's like you have to complete these 12 steps before you can leave the convent or the seminary with the badge of on your shoulder, and you have to do them with a sponsor and so on and so forth. Um, uh, some people in AA, as you know very well, will say you're not in a real AA member until you've done the 12 steps with a sponsor. I that isn't I did them maybe 4 times actually with sponsors. I didn't ever quite see that they were as valuable as some people have found them. But not to say they're not for many people. They're good for a lot of people. I'm positive because they say so. Are they required? Is it a sort of a sacramental, ceremonial thing that everybody must go through in the same way? I doubt it. And but you have two options with AA, and actually a third option, which is hybrid. So one way to do it is just to go to the meetings, find a fellowship, find friends who are trying to do the same hard thing, build solidarity with them, and get yourself time away from your substance and figure out new ways to live. The other way is to become, a AA fundamentalist. I do know the big book almost by heart. Sometimes I feel, but I don't feel like everything in it is a great pearl of wisdom that I need that everybody else needs to memorize.
Yeah.
No, but I do think that yeah, I think that acknowledging one's mistakes, being, confessing to someone else what one has done, these all work for me, of course, but I was raised as a Roman Catholic, so confessional practices, God, things like that are not too hard for people raised in certain traditions, but
Yeah, yeah.
not,
So that's a great point that comparing both, there is a sea of difference between Roman Catholic confession and talking to your group of peers, your friends in AA.
that's right.
And so there's maybe I want to stay a little longer on what the quality of that talking is compared to other experiences. And so it's not just a confession, but
Yeah,
is it something about being able to be seen for who you are?
yeah,
Or, just what comes up for you about that?
yeah. No, that's a nice way to put it. Yeah, yeah. Again, it's the fact that, you know, you're making me think that there's so many different aspects that led me to appreciate the friendships I had with AA. First of all, like you say, it's not, I mean, maybe if you go through the steps officially and you officially do the steps where you tell your entire story to another member of AA and you go through, what were your difficulties with anger? What were your difficulties with fear and resentment? What are your difficulties with sex? Um, that can feel more like, say, Catholic confession, where the person on the other side isn't necessarily going to say anything to you except listen. And maybe instead of saying, say, three Our Fathers and three Hail Marys, they'll just say, okay, do you feel better? Now go and try not to drink for today. But in the little ebb and flow, even of meetings, what in many ways meetings are about, right, are when you share your experience, strength, and hope, you tell little parts of your life story as an addict in a community that is completely safe, of people who will receive it as it's intended. And of course, people early in recovery think things like, "Oh my God, when I tell them such and so, they won't believe it." Well, there is nothing unbelievable in a room of addicts. Nothing. There's never been anyone who's ever said anything where people go, "Could you believe it? Unbelievable. She did
Right.
that." Oh, we've heard it all, and that's actually a wonderful feeling, because part of being an addict is being so isolated, because there's a wonderful book by Caroline Knapp. She's passed away. I think it's called Drinking a Love Story. And she says something like this. She said, "And what about our intimate relationships?" She said, "Mostly we lie." And I think that certainly was true of me. It wasn't always overt lies, but it was just kind of like, you make sure you have enough liquor in your system, that you don't appear drunk, but that you're not you're not jonesing, you're not in withdrawal, and you brush your teeth and you comb your hair to make sure you don't look drunk, but you kind of are. Okay. Until you can get away from all those people, like sometimes it's your wife and your kids, until you drink again and then you can fall asleep unconscious. So there's all kinds of that strategizing and the fear of being caught, because if you're caught, then someone's going to try to stop you from drinking. But you're a drinker, that's your essence, that's your identity. And so it's so lonely. So one of the things that being either, and I'm sure group therapy does the same thing, um, there's a ability to just share with other people in a trusting mode that is,
Yeah. Yeah.
for me, just
So
pivotal.
what I'm hearing, there's a notion of identity. So your identity is oriented around drinking, and so in lots of ways it's that.
Yep,
But in the AA friendships, what you discover is that you can find a group to identify with whom that part no longer has to be secret.
that's right. Exactly. That's right. And it can also be, it's yeah, and of course, usually by then, going back to your first couple of questions, it's so interesting for each person to have to think about and account for in their own way, their own history. Of course, that's what we do at meetings. We try to explain how we got there, to wanting to recover. We usually all know how hard it is for each and every one of us, depending on where we are in the program, to get better. But we are with other people who actually, even if they don't like us individually, like want to go out with us to the movies or to, get coffee or whatever after, not, you don't want to become best friends. You usually love that they're trying to stop drinking and you really want to help them. That's what I always notice. People just, they just care so much about each other,
Yeah.
uh,
Um,
even if you're not necessarily going to be bosom buddies.
right.
Yeah.
Because it's a caring about in some ways there's a real empathy because it's a common situation and common
Yeah.
endeavor.
Exactly right. Yeah. Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
seems like a great place to end, but I want to just check with you if there's something else you would want to add.
Not that I can think of. That was a very helpful. What you took me into thinking about this in a way that I don't always think about. In fact, I'll just say one final thing. Uh, and what you said about the kind of friendships. I had a psychiatrist who I adored when I was in graduate school. I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was the head of Harvard's family health, family therapy. He was a great guy, and but I never talked to him about my drinking.
Hmm.
I sometimes will say in retrospect, I paid $180 an hour. That was by 1980s. That was a lot of money. He was very
Yep.
expensive. I paid $180 an hour, and I kept thinking, he's not bringing up drinking. And if he's not, I'm not. And maybe, and it was kind of, again, it's insane in retrospect. But the point is, I didn't feel, I mean, I remember thinking, but he's this mature, successful, graybeard psychiatrist. He doesn't want to hear from a schlemiel like me about my drinking problems. And but in retrospect, it was just I didn't. I mean, it's obvious that that's crazy, but I didn't feel safe enough with him to get down to where I needed to go at the time.
Yeah.
And he passed away a long time ago, and I think he never ever would have known or suspected that during those years I was truly alcoholic. I saw him once a week.
Wow.
Now, that's as much on me. It's not on him at all. It's on me. But my point is, once you find people who you can be in solidarity with because you all share the same problem, that was key to my healing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what it feels really, what comes up for me is the sense of not just safety in an abstraction, just somebody, but in a way, that sense of coming home
Yeah.
uh, to who you are,
Yes.
and seeing it reflected in other people's eyes, so that you can believe that this you exists.
Yeah. That's a nice way to put it. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.